in our first session, we were looking at things that happened, events that happened thousands of years ago, very ancient battles. Our aim for this second session is to bring things right up to date and to have a bit of a deep dive into the nations that are mentioned in Ezekiel 38 and see what's happening in the world today and how the alliances are forming and the preparation that the king of the north, that Gog is making, that we know will culminate in them coming down onto the mountains of Israel. So we've just read Ezekiel 38 with Brother Dan, and we need to start at the beginning of this chapter where we have a list of very ancient names. So Ezekiel 38 verse 1, and the word of the Lord came unto me saying, Son of man, set thy face against Gog of the land of Magog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, prophesy against him and say, Thus saith the Lord God, behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. So this is the first groupings of nations, and as you will probably know, chief prince, it's also rendered prince of Rosh, Rosh meaning the head. So we're going to be using that translation of it in our talks. But there's also other nations that come down with this initial grouping of nations. In verse 5, we have Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya with them, all of them with shield and with helmet. And I want you to note that in the Hebrew, Ethiopia is Cush and Libya is foot. We then have in verse 6, Gomer and all his bands, the house of Gomer of the north quarters and all his bands. And then later on in the chapter, we have the nations that oppose this invader that comes down. In verse 13, we have Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish with all the young lions thereof. So those are the key names that are mentioned in Ezekiel 38. Now, we find that with these names that they're very ancient, and almost all of them occur back in the book of Genesis. So let's go all the way back to Genesis chapter 10, and let's see where these originate from. Now, Genesis chapter 10 is the descendants of Noah after the flood. And you'll remember that Noah in verse 1 had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And we start in verse 2 with the sons of Japheth. So verse 2, the sons of Japheth, Gomer and Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal and Meshech and Tiraz. And the sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarmah. And the sons of Javan, Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodanim. So the ones that we've got on the screen there, you can see the links through to Ezekiel 38. I'll highlight Madai. Madai is associated with the Medes, and we know from Bible prophecy primarily that the Medes and the Persians were very allied together. So we've got Persia mentioned in Ezekiel 38. So I'm going to link Madai, the Medes, with Persia of Ezekiel 38. The others are straight out of Ezekiel 38, with the exception of Tiraz. And it's been suggested that Tiraz is associated with Rosh. Remember the chief prince that we briefly mentioned. Verse 3, which we read, were the sons of Gomer, so Ashkenaz, Riphath, and then Togarmah. Togarmah from Ezekiel 38. And then the sons of Javan, we've got Elisha, Tarshish, verse 13 of Ezekiel 38, Kittim, and Dodanim. So what does it say of these sons of Javan? Well, verse 5, by these were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their lands, everyone after his tongue, after their families, in these nations. So it's the isles of the Gentiles. I'd like you to remember that phrase, because that'll be something we'll briefly look at in our last session this afternoon. And Japheth is the father of the of the European nations. So that's the sort of overriding grouping that we have with Japheth. So if we come down to verse 6, we've then got on the sons of Ham, Cush, Mizraim, Phut, and Canaan. So remember we said Cush is Ethiopia, Phut is Libya, so the two Ezekiel 38 nations. And then interestingly, from Cush, we have these sons. So verse 8, and Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord, before it had been said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. Now, we mentioned him in connection with Genesis 14, didn't we? So we've got this Babel, this Babylon connection here, descendants through Cush. And then if we then take that on a little bit further, so one of Cush's sons was Reama, and Reama's sons were Sheba and Dedan, the two that are allied with Tarshish in Ezekiel 38. So it would seem then that pretty much all of the names that are mentioned in Ezekiel 38 have their origins here in Genesis chapter 10. So they started off as sons. They started off as individuals, and then they had families. Those families would have grown. They spread out geographically. And so it's the descendants of these individuals, the populations, where they ended up, that we need to try and identify, as well as the characteristics that are brought out about these people. Now, there's one key name that's missing from Genesis chapter 10. Can anybody spot the key name that's missing from Genesis 10 that we've got in Ezekiel 38? Gog, yeah, thank you. Yeah, Gog's missing from Genesis chapter 10. So why is that? Well, let's go back to Ezekiel 38, and we find that Gog is the leader. So he's the figurehead, as it were. And we're told that Gog, he's of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh. And so Gog, it's a bit like a family name or a dynasty. So think of the pharaohs or think of the czars. That's how we should think of Gog. So what do we know of Gog, and in particular the land of where Gog came from, which is the land of Magog? Well, Josephus says that the Magogites, so those of Magog, he says were named by the Greeks as the Scythians, and that's our key for understanding the area of land that we're dealing with. So we don't have Scythia today. Where was it in history? Well, you need to turn your head on one side because the map's slightly lopsided. But the Scythians occupied the territory of land to the north of the Black Sea, which is really interesting because that's Ukraine today. And when you look at the history identifying the Scythians, they pick out the various rivers you can see sort of running across the top of, or that feed into the Black Sea, and that was the domain of the Scythians. Now, the Scythians were nomadic people. They didn't build very much or write very much, so there isn't a great deal of archaeological evidence about them. But we do know that they were very able horsemen and that they were mighty warriors. Now, this is significant, I would suggest, with the description that we have of Gog, of the land of Magog, in verse 4 of Ezekiel 38, where it says, I'll turn thee back and put hooks into thy jaws, and I'll bring thee forth, and all thine army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed with all sorts of armour, a great company of buckless shields, all of them handling swords. And I would suggest that if you lived in the time of Ezekiel, you'd have been familiar with the power of the Scythians, and this northern invader on horses and horsemen would have struck that chord with you. Now, Ezekiel prophesied in the time of Babylon, and you remember just before the Babylonians was the empire of Assyria, and the empire of Assyria was to the south, so you can see on the map where Assyria was in history. So we're talking sort of Iraq, a northern Syria territory. So this is Ashurbanipal, who was one of the leaders of Assyria. He was king of Assyria. He was a very humble man. He claimed that he was king of the universe, did Ashurbanipal. And the Assyrians were a very fierce fighting force, but they had problems with the Scythians to the north. And you could actually say that the Assyrians were afraid of the Scythians. Now, there's lots of archaeological information about Ashurbanipal, primarily these clay tablets, and this is the Ashurbanipal cylinder, where they carefully recorded much of their history. And on this Ashurbanipal cylinder, which you can go and see in the British Museum, it says this, speaking of the king of Syria, where he says, at the time of Bishatri, chief of the Medes, Shahati Pahir, sons of Gagai, chieftain of the land of Sahai, and another translation of this would be sons of Gog, chief of the Saka, or the Scythians, who was thrown off the yoke of my dominion of their strong cities. I captured and carried off their spoil. Then I seized the life in my own hands and brought to Nineveh my royal city. So this was an actual victory over these Scythians by the Assyrians. So it would seem in history that Gog and Magog were literal historical characters. But this prophecy of Ezekiel 38 isn't something that happened in the past. It's something that's going to happen in the future. How do we know that? Well, it's verse 8, isn't it? After many days thou shalt be visited. In the latter years thou shalt come into the land. So we're looking for something in the latter days that has the same role, the same characteristics as these Scythians and this leader of Magog, that of Gog. Well, let's look at some of the other names that are associated with Gog. We've got Meshech and Tubal. So what does history tell us about this? Well, Herodotus said that they were the Moshai or the Tibarianai, which doesn't help us particularly unless we know that geography. Historian Bocart says they inhabited the Moshian Mountains between the Black and the Caspian Seas. In other words, it's talking about the same area of land, or a very similar area of land as that of Scythia that we commented earlier. And some commentators have linked the names of these places with cities of Russia today. So Meshech being associated with Moscow. And it's interesting that the Russian boat, the Moskov, sank this week. Well, the Moskov, that's the Russian name for Moscow. So linking it with Meshech. Tubal, associated with the far eastern city of Russia of Tobolsky. And then we have this other phrase, this chief prince, which, as we say, is the prince of Rosh in the Hebrew. It means the head, and it's, or the chief, and Gesenius, so the Hebrew lexicographer, I have difficulty saying that name, that word. So Gesenius, he said that Rosh was undoubtedly to the Russians who were mentioned by the Byzantine writers of the 10th century under the name of Rosh. And we made the link back in Genesis 10 that Tiraz is possibly Rosh. Now, this link is very, very pertinent and interesting to what's happening today, because back in the 9th and 10th centuries, we have this empire that was known as the Kievan Rus. And immediately we can make the link between Rosh and Rus. And it was the Greek Septuagint version of the Old Testament that used the Greek translation of the word Rosh as the same Greek word that's used to describe this empire, the Kievan Rus. Now, the first great ruler of the Kievan Rus in 980 AD was a man called Vladimir the Great. That's how you would pronounce his name if you were Russian. If you were Ukrainian, you would say he was Volodymyr the Great. And again, it's interesting how history kind of pans out. But today we've got Vladimir Putin, who has the same name. And we also have Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian premier, who has the same name as well. Now, Vladimir the Great, he started off life as a pagan. He was able to unite the various pagan Slavic tribes that lived in this area of Europe. And legend has it that he decided to renounce paganism and to adopt a new religion, but he didn't know which religion to choose. So he sent his ambassadors out to go and find out about the great world religions. So he sent a team out to the Muslims, and they reported back to him saying that if you become a Muslim, you can't eat pork or drink alcohol. And he dismissed that, saying that drinking is the joy of all the Rus. So that's why the Russians didn't become Muslims. The Jewish faith was dismissed because they'd lost their capital and homeland. That's why, how can we follow a faith where they have no center anymore? They're in exile. And eventually he chose to follow the Christianity of Constantinople. So this is the Eastern Orthodox Church as we know it today. And the reason why they adopted that is that they went to the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, which is Istanbul today, this magnificent cathedral. And his ambassadors said that they didn't know whether they were on earth or in heaven. So great was this cathedral that they had seen. So Vladimir was baptized, and he forced all of his country, so all of the Kievan Rus, to be baptized. There was thousands and thousands of them were baptized in the Dnieper River. And this is the origins of the power of Russia today. It's how Russia gets its name. It's how Belarus gets its name. And its capital was Kiev, or Kiev. So now the news extensively refers to it. And it was only much later, many centuries later, that the capital of Russia became Moscow. Now, the key link here is the links that the ancient Kievan Rus Empire had with the Byzantine Empire. So this is the Eastern Roman Empire. The Kievan Rus traded with the Byzantines extensively. They had military alliances, and they had this very strong religious alliance in adopting the same version, if you like, of Christianity. And when Constantinople fell to the Turks in 1453, the people fled, or many of the people fled from Constantinople north up into the Kievan Rus, up into Russia. And we'll come back to that a little later. Now, why is all this ancient history so significant? Well, July last year, Vladimir Putin wrote an essay, a 7,000-word essay. It's well worth reading. It's almost like a commentary on Ezekiel 38 from the Russian president. But he says, on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. And I'll just read you an extract from it. He said, Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians are all descendants of ancient Rus, which was the largest state in Europe. Slavic and other tribes across the vast territory from Lagoda, Novograd, Pskov to Kiev and Chernigov were bound together by one language, which we now refer to as Old Russian, economic ties to all of the princes of the Rurik dynasty, and after the baptism of Rus, the Orthodox faith, the spiritual choice made by St. Vladimir was both Prince of Novograd and Grand Prince of Kiev, still largely determines our affinity today. And so, in other words, what Vladimir Putin is saying is that Ukraine, it's the same as Russia. He says that it's the same heritage, the same background, all going back to this Kievan Rus empire. And this was his pretext, and continues to be his pretext for the invasion that he has launched on the Ukrainian people. He sees it as taking back this Kievan Rus empire. And so 2 months ago, he launched his war against Ukraine. And it's been a huge struggle, hasn't it? It's played out daily in our news, this struggle between the Russian bear, as it were, and the atrocities that the Russians, the bombings, the terrible things that are happening in Ukraine, and how Ukraine is wanting to, or the current leadership of Ukraine at least, wants to stay with the West, and the Western nations are supporting Ukraine in different ways. But we need to remember that this isn't just something that's flared up in the last few months. It's been going on for a long time. Back in 2014, Russia annexed Crimea. You remember that overnight little green men in uniforms popped up all over Crimea. There was a very quick election and the Russian parties won, and Crimea became Russia. And there's been this war in the Donbass region ever since, and that seems to be where the fighting is now focused in Ukraine, and remains to be seen how that works its way through. So the nations that we've mentioned so far, Rosh, Magog, Meshech, Tubal, all points towards Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, those sort of countries that we're dealing with. But back in Ezekiel 38, we know that there are many other nations that are allied with the king of the north. We made the point earlier, didn't we? The emphasis on the many people that are with Gog when she comes down. If we just turn the chapter to Ezekiel 39 and verse 1, therefore, son of man, prophesy against Gog and say, thus saith the Lord God, behold, I'm against thee, Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. Sorry, this is just a repeat of what she's going to do. Verse 2, I'll turn thee back and leave thee but the sixth part of thee, and will cause thee to come up from the north part, so I'll bring thee upon the mountains of Israel. So she comes from the north, and she comes with many people with her. And there is this real emphasis on the north. We've just read it there in chapter 39 and verse 2. We read it in verse 6, that the house of Togomar of the north quarters. Come down to verse 15, and thou shalt come out of thy place out of the north parts with many people with thee. So there's an emphasis on the multitude of people with the king of the north, and there's this emphasis that she comes from the north. Well, what is she north of? Well, she's north of the invading, or where she's going to invade, which is Israel. And if we draw a line directly north of Israel, the land that we come to is eastern Ukraine. It's the Donbass region and Crimea, and then up into Moscow. But the prophecy dictates that it's from the uttermost parts of the north. And it's really interesting that just recently, Moscow has been very interested in the Arctic. You can't get much more north than the Arctic. And just over the last few months, Moscow has been reopening Cold War military bases in the Arctic. And back in 2007, the Russians did a bit of a stunt by sending a submersible under the ice cap of the North Pole and planting a titanium Russian flag on the seabed of the North Pole, claiming it as her own. And that's caused all sorts of consternation with the other countries that have territorial claims over that area. Now, you don't get any more north than the very North Pole. So that's interesting that Russia has been doing that. So what about the many peoples that are with Russia? Well, Ezekiel 38 gives us some key names, but I suggest it's not exclusive, because other prophecies like Zechariah 14, for example, talk about all nations coming against Jerusalem to battle. But let's look at some of the key names that we have in Ezekiel 38. Ezekiel 38, verse 5, we have Persia mentioned. Now, it wasn't that long ago that Persia existed as a nation. In fact, Persia existed until 1935, when the name of Persia was changed to Iran. And we've still got the Persian Gulf today, so that helps us identify what part of land we're talking about. Now, in its history, the Persian Empire extended a much greater extent than Iran does today, and that's a map of the old Persian Empire from 500 BC. So I would suggest Persia indicates a wider area than just solely Iran, and I would suggest it indicates possibly Iraq and Syria as well. Now, what has Iran been doing in relation to Russia? Well, Iran and Russia are very, very close. Every year they carry out joint military exercises in the Caspian Sea. They trade a lot together, despite the sanctions against Russia and the sanctions against Iran. In fact, that's probably driving a lot of the trade. Russia supplies nuclear expertise to Iran. So what's Iran's response been to Russia invading Ukraine? Well, as the world shuns Russia over its invasion of Ukraine, Iran strengthens its ties with Moscow. So Iran and Russia are very close, just like we expect them to be, in accordance with Ezekiel 38. Now, one of the areas where Iran is particularly close to Russia on is what's been happening in Syria, because Iran's been supporting the Assad regime in Syria, as has Vladimir Putin. And without the Russian support of Syria, Assad would no longer be in control of his country, but he is. And the Russians have provided a great deal of military support to Syria. There's a very large Russian military base and naval base at Tartus on the borders of Syria. So what's been Assad's response to Russia invading Ukraine? Well, Assad says Russia's Ukraine invasion a correction of history. In other words, he's completely agreeing with Vladimir Putin's essay about Ukraine. And a few weeks ago, there was a news article saying that Syria to supply Russia with 40,000 mercenaries. They were going to assist with troops to Ukraine. And it's suggested that they're going to do this under a group called the Wagner Company, which we'll come to a little later. Now, Syria is very significant because Syria borders onto Israel. The interface is at a place called the Golan Heights. And the King of the North in Ezekiel 38 comes down upon the mountains of Israel. This is part of the mountains of Israel. It's a bit more further down as well, but the Golan Heights is certainly the mountains of Israel. And when Russia first invaded Ukraine, the Israeli government condemned it. And Russia then said, well, if you don't like what we're doing in Ukraine, well, we're no longer going to recognize Israeli sovereignty of the Golan Heights. Russia said, well, that belongs to Syria. It's a very important strategic location for Israel. And since then, Israel sort of retracted its comments, and it's had to tread very carefully with what it says to Russia. Let's move on then. Let's have a look at verse 5, Libya, which is foot. Now, this is north of Africa, and again, foot historically was probably a slightly wider area than just Libya today. But what's been happening in Libya? Well, since the fall of Colonel Gaddafi about 10 years ago, Libya has been torn apart by a civil war. The government in the west of Libya is UN-backed, and they've got control of Tripoli. But in the east, and the majority of the land in Libya, that's controlled by a man called Khalifa Haftar, and he's backed by Russia. And the backing of General Khalifa Haftar is with this mercenary group called Wagner, which I mentioned earlier. Now, Wagner is a very secretive organization. It's filled with special forces type people funded by Russian money. And it's said that Wagner has responsibility for President Putin's own security detail. Now, the motto that Wagner has in terms of its operation is that death is our business and business is good. And it's a very murky kind of organization. And Wagner's been operating in Libya. There was disruption to some voting that should have took place in December. So we need to ask the question is, why is Russia interested in Libya? Well, Libya has Africa's largest reserves of oil. And that seems to be a motivator behind Russian involvement in Libya. Okay, let's move on then. At the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the UN took a vote which condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine and demanded an immediate withdrawal. Now, of the 193 members of the UN, 141 members voted in favour of the motion to condemn Russia. 35 abstained, and just 5 voted against. Now, the 5 that voted against was firstly Russia. You'd expect them to vote against the motion against them. Secondly, Belarus. You can understand that one. Thirdly, Syria. Well, we've already seen how closely Syria and Russia are aligned. Fourth, North Korea. I'm not going to try and link North Korea with Bible prophecy. And then the 5th one was this country, Eritrea. Now, hands up if you know where Eritrea is. Richard does. One at the back. Not many of you. Where is it?
Africa.
Yeah, whereabouts?
About halfway down the east coast.
Yeah. So, oops, not too far. Yeah, it is, well, it used to be, up until 1993, part of Ethiopia. And this is really significant because this brings us to Cush and Ethiopia. So let's have a look at this. In the Hebrew, Cush means black. And there's a famous verse in Jeremiah talking about how Israel wouldn't move their hearts and change their lives to follow God. And Jeremiah said, can the Ethiopian change his skin or the leopard his spots, likening it to the hard-heartedness of Israel? And Cush, black, denotes the skin color of the people that live in this region. Now, the ancient Cush Empire was quite extensive, and it includes Eritrea today, Ethiopia, and the Sudan. It's to the south of Egypt, and the Cushite Empire was reliant on the Nile. It incorporated 6 sections of the River Nile. And it also went by the names of the Kingdom of Nubia, if you've heard of that, or the Cushite Kingdom, as we've just mentioned. And in its history, it was very wealthy, very prosperous because of its trading on the Nile, and it was also military powerful. So you go back to 2 Chronicles 12 and 14, and Rehoboam and the like, who had wars against the empire of Cush, or from Ethiopia. Now, Eritrea, Sudan, and Ethiopia are all strongly linked with Russia. So this is from July 2021, Ethiopia inked military cooperation agreements with Russia. Russia's supplying military expertise, technology, and knowledge to this country. Now, why would Russia do this? When we think of Ethiopia, it's a very poor country. Why is Russia interested in Ethiopia? Well, just as a suggestion for you, there's a fascinating infrastructure project happening in Ethiopia, which might be a motive for them. And it's called this, it's the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, GERD for short. Now, virtually all of Egypt's water comes from the Nile, okay? And about 98% of the population of Egypt still lives within 10 miles of the River Nile. So without the Nile, Egypt, even today, is pretty much finish. Now, the source of the Nile comes from two tributaries, the Blue Nile and the White Nile. So the White Nile runs through Sudan. The Blue Nile has its origins in Ethiopia. It's called the Blue Nile and the White Nile because of the different coloured sediment that comes down those tributaries. Now, Ethiopia has built a huge dam and created a massive lake behind this dam to help the fertility of the land in Ethiopia, because a lot of the sediment just washes down the river, which helps Egypt's fertility in terms of the growing of its crops. But also this dam will be a massive hydropower supply for Ethiopia. In fact, it's going to double her current electricity supply in the country, and she's going to have so much electricity that she's actually going to be able to sell it to nearby countries. Now, when Russia did this deal to supply military arms to Ethiopia, this news report came out. Russia rejects attempts to link its military cooperation with Ethiopia and GERD. Now, when Russia denies something, you know that it's true, or it's usually true. And this dam is incredibly contentious. Egypt has been opposing this dam for many years now. In fact, they considered military action against Ethiopia about 5 years ago. They didn't do that. But this dam has just opened, or it's opening now. It's starting to fill the massive lake behind it. Now, we know that when the king of the north comes down, that he comes down into the land of Egypt. Daniel 11, verse 42 tells us that. But I'd like us to go to Isaiah chapter 18, because it's a really interesting verse in Isaiah chapter 18, which is an end-time prophecy that we normally apply to a slightly different understanding of where Cush is, sort of more into Iran, Iraq area. But I'd like us to look at these first, perhaps with the link with what's happening here. Isaiah 18, verse 1 says, "Woe to the land shadowing with wings, which is beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, and the White Nile and the Blue Nile, the rivers of Cush." Verse 2, "that sendeth ambassadors by the sea, even the vessels of bulrushes upon the water, saying, Go ye to swift messengers, to a nation scattered and peeled, to a people terrible from their beginning hitherto, a nation meted out and trodden down, whose land the rivers have spoiled." So I just wonder whether there's a link here with this dam and the spoiling of the rivers of the Nile, and that sort of weakening of Egypt. And I just wonder if that's one of the mechanisms that Gog's going to use when he comes down against Egypt. I'll leave you to ponder that. It's a tricky verse, I think, to get our heads around fully, and I'll welcome any comments on it afterwards. So what about Sudan? Well, 3 weeks after the invasion of Ukraine had started, the Sudanese minister went to Moscow, and he signed an agreement with Vladimir Putin that Putin had sanctioned in November 21 for a new military and naval base in Sudan, in the coasts of the Red Sea. So that's where Russia is going to build a naval base in Sudan. And again, that's really significant, isn't it? Because in Daniel chapter 11, we're told that the king of the north. Well, let's have a look at that one. We have to turn to Daniel 11, haven't we? Let's open Daniel 11. Let's make the link. So Daniel chapter 11. Verse 40, "At the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over." And to be able to do that, you need your navy. They've just lost one of their big ships as Russia, but let's see what happens as things progress. Okay, so those are I'd say the more straightforward nations to pin down. we've got two that are left. We've got Gomer and Togarmah. And we need to try and link those two together. Well, in Genesis chapter 10, Togarmah, you'll remember, is Gomer's son. And Gomer is linked with Galatia, which is Turkey. So think of the 7 letters, think of Galatia being Gomer. Now, it seems that Gomer then moves more into Western Europe. Gomer is also associated with the Gauls, so parts of Germany, France. And Togarmah is now more typically associated with Turkey. And Togarmah in Ezekiel 38 is described as being the north quarters, like Gog himself. And Turkey is certainly to the north of Israel. So what do we know about Turkey? Well, we could spend quite a few sessions looking at Turkey. It's very significant in Bible prophecy. In Daniel chapter 8 and Daniel chapter 11, we have the rise of the Eastern Roman Empire, also called the Byzantine Empire, and the Eastern Orthodox Church, which came from it. It outlasted the Roman Empire by about 1,000 years, or the Western Roman Empire by about 1,000 years. And as we alluded to earlier, Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453, and it was renamed Istanbul. And so that was the end, as it were, of the Eastern Roman Empire. And there's some really detailed prophecies about that event in Revelation chapter 9, which is fascinating to look at. Now, as we said earlier, when that city fell, many of the people fled north up into Russia and into that old Kievan Rus area. Now, it's interesting that the emblem of the Byzantines, the double-headed eagle, that is the same emblem that Russia has today in its coat of arms. And this Eastern Roman Empire was replaced by the Turkish Empire. Well, come with me, please. Keep a marker in Daniel 11. We're going to come back there in just a moment. Let's go to Revelation chapter 16. Because one of the key things that has to happen before the Battle of Armageddon is the drying up of the river Euphrates. Revelation chapter 16 and verse 12. Says, and the sixth angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared. And then later on in the chapter, we come down to the Battle of Armageddon. And the river Euphrates runs through Turkey. And it's suggested that the drying up of the river Euphrates is the drying up of the Turkish Empire. And over the last 150, 200 years or so, the Turkish Empire has shrunk massively. And much of that was done in the last century. So let's go back to Daniel chapter 11. And this time, let's read verse 40 again. It says, at the time of the end, shall the king of the south push at him? Well, firstly, who is the king of the south? Well, it's not our subject for today, but the king of the south is Britain and her allies. It's Tarshish, those trading nations, along with Sheba and Dedan. So who is the him? Well, the him here, what I would suggest is Turkey. And the reason for that is this history of the Eastern Roman Empire and how it transfers across over to the Turkish sort of power. But we've then got the king of the north coming against him. Just keep reading that verse. And the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, with horsemen, with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries and shall overthrow. So is the him here the king of the south? Well, no, the context suggests that the king of the north comes against Turkey again, comes against the Turkish Empire. That's the detail I would suggest that we have here in verse 40. So why would Russia come against Turkey? Well, it's so the River Euphrates is finally dried up completely. We've seen partial drying up, but Turkey is still there. And I suggest that Russia is very interested in Turkey because of this city, because of Istanbul and Constantinople, and particularly the straits, the water straits that are controlled by Turkey, which is the Bosporus. Let's just briefly have a look at this. This is the strip of sea that gives access through to the Mediterranean from the Black Sea, the Bosporus Strait, and it's a relatively narrow shipping lane. Now, access to and from it is governed by the 1936 Montreux Convention, and in peacetime it gives merchant ships free access to the Black Sea. But in time of war, Turkey can change that. So in peacetime, I should say, any warships that don't belong to countries that are bordered on the Black Sea, so in other words, Russia and Ukraine and that, so warships over a certain size are not allowed into the Black Sea, so NATO can't send its aircraft carriers into the Black Sea because of this convention. And when there's a war going on, Turkey can close off any warships' access to the Black Sea. And interesting, I was reading yesterday that this Magog ship that's been sunk, Russia doesn't have a replacement currently in the Black Sea for that ship. It's got other ships in the Eastern Mediterranean, but it's not allowed to send them through because Turkey has closed off that strait because of the war to Russian carriers, which is interesting, isn't it? Now, Turkey's doing something very interesting in this area. President Erdogan of Turkey has started work on what's called the Istanbul Canal, a 45-kilometre long second route through, which will make Istanbul an island. It's going to cost $10 billion. And the idea is that it will ease congestion in the Bosporus Strait. It'll enable Turkey to raise revenue because we have to charge ships to go through it. But crucially, this completely circumnavigates the Montreux Convention. It's going to allow NATO warships into the Black Sea. Now, I think we need to watch this. Is Russia going to be happy with that if that continues to happen? Well, something to look out for. Our time's going, as it always does. Okay, now the other thing about Turkey is that it is a member of NATO. And a lot of this war in Ukraine has been how Russia and NATO are opposing each other. And there's other countries that are looking to join NATO. There was talk of Ukraine wanting to join NATO, but now said that they won't. Finland and Sweden are looking to join NATO. But I would suggest that Scripture requires that by the time of the end, that NATO alliance has to be broken. Because we've already commented on Turkey, NATO member, being with the King of the North, or having certainly its land taken by the King of the North. But then we've also got Gomer, which, as we said, indicates more some of the Western European nations, Germany and France, as being allied with the King of the North. And at the moment, those nations are firmly opposed to Russia, it would seem. So is there anything we can see that might change that? Are there any potential cracks emerging? Well, one of the key ones is energy, isn't it? There's so much in the news about this at the moment, how Europe, Western Europe is so reliant on Russian gas and oil. And here's the percentage of domestic consumption for various countries in Europe on Russian gas. A few weeks ago, there was a lot in the press about Nord Stream 2, and Germany canned it at a cost of 11 billion, this pipe from Russia. But what's sometimes forgotten is that Nord Stream 1 is still going full stream ahead. It's been operating for a long time now. It's running at full capacity, providing gas into Russia. providing gas into Germany from Russia. And I read a report this week that if Germany closes off Russian gas and oil imports, it will cost their economy $220 billion and cause a recession worth around 6% contraction. So similar to the recession that we had because of COVID. Now, are they going to do that? Well, I suspect not, but let's see what happens. There also seems to be some cracks emerging in the NATO alliance. Here's Macron from a few weeks ago. Macron stepped up an EU army plan to deter Russian threat. And he said this because he said he couldn't rely on America and Britain. Europe needed their own force to do this. And France is one to watch again, because France is going through some elections at the moment. We've got Macron versus Marine Le Pen. She's a nationalist. She's seen as a supporter to Putin in Moscow. We don't know how that election is going to pan out, but again, something to keep an eye on. Things can change very, very quickly. But what Europe is doing is it's arming itself. Germany to ramp up military spending in major policy shifts. Germany is going to be spending 100 billion euros on its armaments, a massive increase. And isn't this just how we expect it would be in accordance with prophecy? Joel 3 that we've read before says, proclaim ye this among the Gentiles, prepare war, wake up the mighty men, let all the men of war draw near, let them come up, beat your plowshares into swords, your pruning hooks into spears, let the weak say, I am strong. Before we conclude, come over with me to Revelation chapter 17. Because we do expect the nations of Europe to have their own army. In Revelation chapter 17, we've got the details of the beast that has the harlot woman riding on her, which we would suggest is Western Europe. It's the EU today. Verse 13 of Revelation 17, these have one mind and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. And we've been seeing that over the last few decades, haven't we? The pooling of power in Europe centrally. And when that happens, verse 14, these shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful. Now, to make war, for these nations to make war with the Lord Jesus Christ, you've got to have an army. And I think that's one of the key things that happened as a result of Brexit, that Britain used its veto to stop a European army. But since Brexit has happened, the EU has been stepping up its aims to create this military force as well as being an economic power. So we see the alignments of the nations being brought together, this jigsaw of the arrangements of those who are allies with the King of the North before she comes down upon the mountains of Israel. It seems to be taking shape, doesn't it? There's so many significant things, and we just touched on just a few of them this morning that are happening. Now, again, I borrowed this slide from Brother Peter Barrett, but I think it's significant because Brother Thomas, when in the preface to Help Us Israel, he said this. He said, when Russia makes its grand move for the building up of its image empire, then let the reader know that the end of all things as at present constituted is at hand. And none of us know how long we will be here before Jesus takes us to judgment. Brother Thomas believed that the judgment of the saints would happen before Gog came down against Turkey. Now, whether that's right or not, we can only speculate. But Jesus said that he comes as a thief. It's when we don't expect it that Jesus returns, if we're not ready and waiting. So whilst all these things are really interesting, it seems there's a few more things, a few more steps that have got to happen. Perhaps the war in Ukraine will die down for a bit. We don't know. But what we can't be complacent about is that the return of the Lord could happen at any time. And we need to make sure that we are ready for that. So in our next session after lunch, we're going to have a bit of a workshop, make it a bit more interactive, and think about some of the Bible prophecies about how the King of the North comes down about Israel, the conditions that Israel's in, and how that all concludes. Thank you very much.